Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first series of webinars on health and well-being. We're glad to see many of you joining the webinar and taking some time out of your busy schedules to listen to us today, talk about what we don't know about anxiety and depression in the workplace. Around the table here at JWSeagon headquarters in Nairobi, we have myself, Shakil Hassan Ali, General Manager at JWSeagon. We also have our Managing Director, David Seagan, in the room, along with our Marketing Executive, Lynn Mungai. Of course, we have our very special guest speaker today, Dr. Yolanda Coombs, who will be taking us through majority of the agenda around anxiety and depression, telling us about the definitions of it, helping us understand more about what happens in our bodies when we're feeling anxious and depressive, when we should be asking for help, useful tips that we can apply both for ourselves and as employers for our teams. And of course, I'm talking about the behaviors and issues that sometimes exemplify some of these concerns in the workplace and what we can do to mitigate those risks. So we're very excited to be having Dr. Yolanda with us today. In terms of the run through on the agenda, I'll talk a little bit about JWSeagon for those of you that don't know who we are and what we do. And then Dr. Yolanda will then take over for 40 minutes and talk us through the agenda I ran through earlier. You will have an opportunity to ask questions. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see a little Q&A tab. If you click on that, you will be able to type in your question. And of course, during the 20 minutes Q&A session after Dr. Yolanda's presentation, we will be able to pick out as many questions, hopefully, as possible and get Dr. Yolanda to answer them in the time allocated. We will do our best to answer all questions, but of course, if we can't, don't fret. We will try and get answers over to you coming out of the webinar. And finally, before we close the webinar, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the products and services that JWSeagon offer that we can actually help to support the conversation about driving a culture of well-being by helping drive a much more informed population on such key topics as anxiety and depression. So this is our second in our series of health and well-being conversations. The first one was around stress and the impact of stress and how employers can mitigate that. And of course, anxiety and depression are kind of key growing concerns, both from an individual perspective, but also more and more prevalent in the workplace. So on to a little bit about JWSeagon. JWSeagon is an independent insurance broker service, offering clients with a trusted one-stop shop service for all the insurance needs. So across medical insurance, general insurance, and life insurance. You can see the long-standing relationships we have with majority of leading local and international health, general, and life insurers. And we bring over 25 years experience in the industry with our team of dedicated insurance advisors and experts who scour the market to provide the best deals both for individuals, SMEs, and corporates. We've got a team of over 40 that are spread across 4 countries, and we service over 11,000 clients across Africa and beyond. And what we try and always uphold is a great customer service, but also a real understanding of the insurance market, sifting through the noise and being able to work with partners that deliver exemplary products, great value, great additional benefits, and of course, a great service. And we'll be talking a bit more about how some of the products that we have worked with some insurance partners will help support the conversation around individuals and employers being able to mitigate anxiety, depression, stress in the workplace, which are absolutely value-add free services that come through any insurance product through JWSeagon. So without further ado, I will now pass on to Dr. Yolanda, who will take us through a presentation. We look forward to it. Welcome, Dr. Yolanda.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me clearly. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you very much to JWSeagon for inviting me to talk, and I hope that you will get some insights here about anxiety and depression, and particularly the role they play in the workplace. I wanted to start by saying that anxiety and depression are two of the fastest growing illnesses in the world, and globally they will become the leading cause of ill health in the next 10 years. So if you run a business, it is likely that you will be having many of your employees suffering from these two issues on a regular basis. So being able to spot them, being able to understand what's going on, knowing what you can do to help, and knowing when people need to seek help are very important. So let's start with anxiety. What is anxiety? Anxiety is often, or can be considered, a normal, healthy emotion. We have anxiety in response to the unknown. Our brain has one job, and our brain's job is to keep us alive. And our minds, our brains, loves to do this by just keeping us with what is familiar. Because when we do what's familiar, when we've done what we've done yesterday, our brain is happy because our chance of anything bad happening to us goes down if we keep on doing the same thing. And so we have an inbuilt anxiety response to anything new, anything unfamiliar. But when people have a disproportionate level of anxiety, when they start to worry about the unknown, that's when anxiety tips into a medical disorder. But we all have worry. Worry, in a way, is just an extension of planning. So it's something which makes human beings successful. I know that I have to be at an appointment at 10 o'clock tomorrow, so what time will I need to leave to get there on time? That's planning. Worry is, well, what if there's traffic? Let me leave 15, 20 minutes early. Anxiety is, what if I run into a huge traffic jam, I miss the appointment, and they're really angry with me, and I lose whatever opportunity I was going for? So different people get anxious by different things. You can be anxious by, you can be worried about particular things. Many people have anxiety, for example, around flying. Other people have anxiety about doing things like public presentations. Anxiety can also be something that you get from just dealing with the unfamiliar, as I said earlier. So it's good to know what triggers your anxiety, and know that when you have got a little bit of anxiety, anxiety can topple over into many more areas. So what's going on when you get anxious? What's going on in your brain? So when you initially feel worried about something, one of the interesting things is that you go into a stress response. And for those of you who attended the other presentation I gave, when you're in a stress response, actually your logical, rational mind often gets switched off, and you are responding with what's called your limbic or emotional brain. So when you're thinking about the workplace, if you have an anxious workforce, they're not going to be performing at their best, because they're going to be performing from their emotional limbic brain rather than from their logical, rational brain. The more and more somebody gets anxious, the more this becomes a loop, so that they close off that logical, rational brain. They're now operating from the limbic brain, and this then has effects that go on throughout the body. So as soon as you're in a stress response, for example, your digestive system often gets switched off as well, and that's to provide power to your limbs for a fight or flight response, which I think people will have heard of. And the way your digestive system gets switched off is to be completely flooded with acid. And so many people who suffer from chronic anxiety suffer from things like heartburn, indigestion, irritable bowel, and these are all chronic issues that you will see a lot within a workforce. When you see people having to take time off for these illnesses, it's likely that there is an underlying anxiety and stress, because anxiety and stress go hand in hand. If you're anxious, you're putting your body into a stress response. And we know that stress leads to 95% of all illnesses. It's a risk factor in every illness. So when you have an anxious workforce or an anxious employee, they're likely to become a sick employee in the future. So anxiety can be good, and particularly in the workplace. Performance anxiety, when we are a little bit anxious when we have to perform, it allows us to perform better. having a little bit of adrenaline when you have to stand up to give a presentation, having a little bit of adrenaline if you're doing a sales pitch. It's good for you. You perform at a slightly better level. But if your anxiety is so much that you completely close down and you switch off, then you're not going to be able to perform at the way you want. Some workplaces have a culture where they put people into an anxious state. So for example, a boss or a particular manager can be quite top down, quite heavy with staff. Know that when you do this, when you put people on the spot, when you try and ask them questions, you're going to make them anxious. When they're anxious, if they're too anxious, they won't perform well because that crucial part of their mind will get switched off and they won't be in a good place in terms of what you're asking them to do. So let's talk a little bit about depression. One of the most recent definitions of depression now is where we talk about high-functioning depression. And we often see people with high-functioning depression in the workplace. So the traditional image we have of depression is somebody sitting at home on the couch in their pajamas, eating ice cream out of a tub, not having washed. But there's also a type of depression where people turn up, they go to work, they do what's required of them, but they're not happy and they're not particularly sad, they're just getting through each day. I call it flatlining, where you get up, you go to work, you do what you need to do, you come home, but you don't feel rewarded, you don't feel happy, you don't feel like you're achieving anything. You're just going through the motions of what you've been asked to do. And this type of depression often is seen amongst executives. It's often seen in certain professions. Lawyers, for example, tend to have a lot of people with depression. Depression can often come from when you're doing very routine work. Depression comes from suppression. When we suppress a part of ourselves, when we suppress who we are, or when someone else suppresses who we are or a part of us, it can lead for us to be depressed. So if you have chosen a career path which is not for you, if you are a bubbly, talkative person who wants to be able to share their ideas and contribute, and yet you find yourself in a workplace culture where you are not encouraged to talk, where you are not encouraged to share your ideas, where there is no opportunity for career growth, you may well become suppressed and then depressed. Also, you may become depressed in situations where somebody is dominating you or not allowing you to express yourselves in the way you want. So the most important thing is to remember is that depression comes from suppression. And if your workplace culture is one which is a closed mindset, where it is very top down, where there is a lot of dictation of how people should behave, what they should do, then you may well get a number of people suffering from depression. So how do anxiety and depression get exacerbated in the workplace? So many people can come to work and they will already have anxiety and depression, which may be caused from other things going on in their life and at home, in terms of how they live, what's going on, in terms of the relationships they have. But it can then become further exacerbated by the workplace that they're in, depending on the culture, depending on who their manager is, depending on the colleagues that they're with, and depending on the demands you're placing on them. So time pressure and frustrations can really, really exacerbate both anxiety and depression. When you put people under pressure, as I said, you put them into a stress response. Anybody who is anxious is going to feel that even more. If you live in Nairobi, you understand time pressures just from traveling around the city on a daily basis. And it can lead to anxiety. And often one of the worst anxieties is when we feel that we have no control, what we call it an uncontrollable stressor. You're stuck in a traffic jam, you're late for a meeting, and there's nothing you can do about it. But sometimes particular workplaces put time pressure on people which is not necessary. So you can have a manager who is a very strict clock watcher, who, when somebody comes in, they look at their watch. I was working with a company recently where one of the managers was recording how long her subordinates took in the bathroom. This puts a huge stress on people, having this kind of time pressure. And if you have anxious people already, if they know they're being watched, again, just as a reminder, their logical, rational part of their brain will be switched off, and you will not be getting the best performance from that employee by making them feel under more pressure. So work can be frustrating. Sales can fall through, deals can collapse, issues can happen. There can be issues around security. There are a number of issues that can happen. So how do we try and reduce the anxiety and stress from time pressure and frustrations? One way is for you to work out yourself, make a little list of what makes you anxious, what makes you frustrated at work. For example, is it that somebody from home rings you all the time? Then have a discussion with them about not calling you when you're at work or having a certain time. I've worked with a number of managers and CEOs who feel like they don't have any time to themselves because at work, people are constantly coming to their desk or coming into their room. So set a time each day where you will close the door and work very carefully on your own, and you don't allow anybody in. Think what you can do to reduce the time pressure and frustrations in your workplace that might be contributing in particular to anxiety, but also to depression if people feel their time is not their own. Because if people feel their time is not their own, that they don't get to choose how they spend it, then they will feel suppressed, and then they likely will become depressed. Anxiety and depression can be exacerbated by experiencing dishonesty or disappointment in the workplace. Because when people let you down, or when people have empty promises, when you're told that things are going to change or things are going to happen and they don't, when people encounter these events, it's a threat to them, it is a threat to how they feel. So for example, if you're in a workplace where your hard work does not get acknowledged, if you stay late behind to get something finished, and the next day your manager doesn't notice that you have stayed late, you're going to feel disappointed, you're going to feel let down. That will contribute and exacerbate anxiety and depression. So know that people work towards rewards. Our brains and our minds are very simple. We get taken towards anything which we link pleasure with, where we feel rewarded, and we move away from anything that we link pain with, that upsets us or hurts us. So in a workplace, the more you can reward, the more you can motivate, the more that people will perform better in their tasks. And the more that you burden them, the more that you punish them, the more that you fail to reward them for good work that they've done, the more anxious and depressed they may well feel. So it's normal to get frustrated and upset by disappointments in the workplace. It's when they're happening on a regular basis that they're more likely to contribute to anxiety and depression. Threats to self-esteem in the workplace. Our self-esteem takes a battering when we feel that we don't feel good enough about ourselves. And I would say, I trained with a therapist called Marissa Peer, and she talks about this a lot as being one of the biggest problems in today's world, not feeling good about yourself. So you don't feel that you've done a good enough job at work. You don't feel that you're a good enough father or mother. You don't feel that you're a good enough brother or a wife or a husband. You don't feel good enough in so many ways. And part of the reasons we don't feel good enough are because of the way that our society is at the moment. Particularly when you look at things like Facebook, Instagram, what you see on those are that everybody shows the perfect side of their life. They show themselves having a fabulous holiday or in a wonderful car or eating in a nice restaurant. And we then don't feel good enough about ourselves because we compare ourselves. The more that we feel that our self-esteem is less than, where we feel less than, then it exacerbates particularly depression. People with depression often don't feel good enough about themselves, often don't feel that they're performing in a way that they should. So the types of things that might happen to you at work are receiving a bad performance evaluation, somebody disrespecting you, making a mistake in front of other people, in front of colleagues, getting rejected, not being picked for a promotion or a training or a reward, losing a pitch. So know that when your colleagues or when your staff are going through these things, it will have an effect on them. And anybody who already has any kind of underlying depression, they're going to feel worse about themselves. Running into prejudice and discrimination can really affect us when we are in the workplace. We know about things that happen, sexual harassment. We can see differences in terms of equality. Sometimes we see particular tribes or groups being picked for careers. Often you can see in the boardrooms, particularly in Kenya, that it's very male dominated. Running into prejudice and discrimination can exacerbate both depression, because of the issue I said of being suppressed, if you are not being rewarded based on merit, and it can affect your anxiety, particularly if the harassment or if there is bullying. Bullying is very common in the workplace. It can happen where a manager is forceful or bullies or uses their power to get more work out of the people that report to them. And bullying can also happen where groups of people are not very welcoming to certain other people. So within a team, you can find there is a group who are bullying others. There's a lot that can be done in terms of policies, but having a policy doesn't eradicate harassment or bullying. Having a policy merely signifies that you've been thinking about it. The training you put into place, the guidance you give, and the culture that you have as an organization, as a business, is going to really determine how well people are doing and how well, and whether these behaviors continue to take place in your workplace. Often people think that there is very little harassment that goes on, but harassment isn't just whether or not you're a perpetrator, but if you know that somebody is doing something and you stand by and watch it, that too constitutes harassment. So know that it is up to all of us to stop these types of behaviors in the workplace. So when you are faced with one of these kinds of behaviors, you're frustrated at work, you don't feel good enough, there's a threat to your self-esteem, you feel bullied or you feel harassed, you're not a victim. There's things that you can do to change it yourself as an individual, as well as in terms of as an employer. But let's just think about what you can do as an individual. Most of us confuse facts for beliefs or facts for thoughts. It isn't the fact that hurts us. It's the thought that we have that gives us the feeling. So when you want to change the way you feel about something, you have to change your thoughts. So let me give you an example. Say you're at work and the boss comes out and says to one of your colleagues, "That was an excellent report you wrote." For some people, what they will take from that is, the boss doesn't think my reports are very good. And that's because the thought they have, they've interpreted it in a particular way. Now, that's not what the boss said in that particular instance. Just as somebody might make a comment, a passing comment, and you feel that it's a criticism. So when you want to change the feeling you have, if you feel you've been criticized, then you're going to feel hurt or rejected or not good enough. So you have to change the thought. Why else might they have said that? What else was going on? Learning to change the thoughts is the best way to change the feelings. And often when people are depressed in particular, they've got themselves into a cycle of thought where they don't feel good enough. They constantly have an internal voice in their head which is critical. You can often know people who might be at risk for depression because they're often very critical people, because critical people reserve the most criticism for themselves, and their internal dialogue is hypercritical of everything they do. It's the same for when you're working with people who get very touchy when you try and give them feedback. And that's often because they're already criticizing themselves and have thought about the thing that you're about to say before you've even said it. So remember, if you want to change a bad feeling, change the thought. So this little emotion wheel is quite useful because sometimes we can't really hone down on what the feeling is. When you start in the middle, it gives you the main emotions. For example, you might say, I'm really angry. Anger is a common feeling at work. And as you move out, you can decide, well, is it that I'm just angry, or is it that I'm frustrated? And then when you look at frustrated, am I annoyed or am I infuriated? Once you can get to the nuance of the feeling that you have, it's more easy to find out the thought that you had that led to it. So if you're feeling angry and you decide, actually, I'm feeling let down. Well, why am I feeling let down? Well, actually, I feel betrayed. Why do I feel betrayed? Oh, I feel betrayed because one of my colleagues told our manager that I wasn't interested in going for promotion, and I didn't want the manager to know that. And then you might think, well, why else might my colleague have told the manager that? Well, maybe my colleague told the manager that because they think I should go for the promotion. As soon as you change the thought, you change the feeling. What's another way that you can get hold and get balance back to your emotions? And that's to shift your emotional state. And one way of shifting our emotional state is to get back to being balanced and centered and to focus. Particularly if you are somebody who is anxious, you tend to be living in the future. What's going to happen in the next hour, in the next afternoon, in the next day, in the next month? If you are depressed, you tend to be living in the past. What did I do wrong? What should I have done? What could I have said? And we know that the healthiest people emotionally are the people who live in the present, who are really focused on what they're doing at that moment. And so if you want to try and shift your emotional state, focus on what you're doing right at this very moment. If you're washing your hands, focus on washing your hands. If you're taking notes, focus on taking notes. If you're talking to somebody, if you're having a conversation, focus on that conversation. In these busy times that we live in, we tend to all be double screening. We have our phone out, we have our laptop open, maybe we have the TV on. We are constantly trying to do several things at once. If you want to get back to feeling how you ought to feel, detach from all the things around you and focus and center on what is immediately in front of you at this moment. Not what you're going to be doing later, not reviewing what you did earlier, but what you're doing now. Because if you live each moment well, then you live your day well. If you suffer from anxiety, the most important thing you can do is learn to breathe. And I'm sure many of you are sitting there thinking, I learned to breathe many, many years ago. But people breathe in the wrong way. People tend to breathe at the very top of their chest, at the top of their lungs. And when you breathe in a shallow way, you send a signal to your brain, to an area of your brain called the thalamus, the hypothalamus and amygdala, this area, and it starts to sense that there's a problem. So if you think about a child when they breathe, they often, when they're upset, they often go, yeah, panting very fast. And that is a breath that we do when we are upset, when we are anxious, when we are worried. So if you want to breathe, if you want to try and take your anxiety down, learn how to sigh. When you sigh, you send a signal through a nerve called the vagus nerve to your brain that you are in a more relaxed state. So when I mean sigh, what I mean is a long, noisy out-breath like this. It's one of the reasons people like smoking, because when they inhale with a cigarette, they breathe out long, it calms the vagus nerve and they feel much better. If you have to make a difficult phone call, before you pick up that phone, take a long out-breath, a long sigh, and you will calm yourself instantly. Some other ways of changing your breathing. Here I've written 2, 3, 5. Breathe in for 2, hold for 3, out for 5. Box breathing, where you breathe in for 4, you hold for 4, breathe out for the count of 4, and hold for the count of 4. If you're very stressed, very anxious, you feel that you're getting into a state of panic, sit with a clock in front of you, and for 5 seconds breathe in, and for 5 seconds breathe out, and then in for 5 seconds, out for 5 seconds, and you do that for 2 minutes. And the longer that you can do that for, the calmer you will be. Don't think about anything in the future, don't think about anything in the past, just breathe. Breathing is really important to you. Breathing sends a signal to your brain about what's going on. The other thing I'd encourage you to learn, and you can do it now, is to put your hand on your belly, underneath your rib cage. And when you breathe in, you should push your hand out. And when you breathe out, your hand should go in. If you're breathing deeply enough, you should be able to push your hand out when you breathe in, and your hand should come in when you breathe out. If your hand's not moving, you're breathing too shallowly. If you're breathing too shallowly, it means that your body thinks it's in a little bit of stress, and you will have cortisol and adrenaline going around your body. So take some time to learn to breathe. There are very good apps, there are very good courses that you can do that will help you learn to breathe better. The other thing is to write. One of the exercises that I give people who I work with who are suffering from anxiety is an exercise that I call worry time. And it sounds very counterintuitive. But if you write down your worries, you learn to deal with them in a very different way. So, as I mentioned earlier, when we are worried, we are thinking about things in the future and they are getting out of control. We then say, I don't want to think about that thing because it's worrying me, and we try not to think about it. But when you're trying not to think about something, you're actually thinking about it. Because for the next 10 seconds, I want you to try not to think about an elephant, and try not to think about a pink elephant, and try not to think about a child's pink elephant. How are you doing with that? Did anybody manage not to think about a child's pink elephant? So the issue is when you think you're not thinking about your worries, you're thinking about them. And it's a bit like having a reminder button on your computer. Your worries, you keep being reminded of them. You keep being reminded of the things that you don't want to think about. And every time you're reminded of them, your body has a little bit more stress. And the reason that your brain is reminding you is because it feels you're not doing anything about the issue. So if, for example, you're worried about your performance at work, but you don't know what you can do about it, every time you think about that issue, you're going to be feeling a little bit more stressed. So the exercise that I give to people is to set a timer for 3 minutes. And during that 3 minutes, you get a piece of paper and you write down everything that you're worried about. You write down, no matter how ludicrous, how much your imagination runs away with you, you write down all those worries. It's not a to-do list. It's not, I need to email these people and write to these people. It's, I'm worried that if I don't pick up my performance, my manager's going to sack me. If I get sacked, I might lose my job. If I lose my job, I might lose my house. If I lose my house, I might end up on the streets. And if I end up on the streets, I might have no money, and that will be the end of me. That's what anxiety is. Write it all down. Keep the timer going for 3 minutes. Don't stop. If you run out of things to write about, start again. And then at the end of 3 minutes, take the piece of paper and rip it up into tiny little pieces and throw it in the bin. And what you will find is that your cortisol, your level of stress, goes down. And I recommend that you do this 2 or 3 times a day to begin with, so that you train your brain that you will worry when you choose to and not when it reminds you to. And generally, after about a week or 10 days, you will find your levels of anxiety have decreased. So the other thing that you can do is that you can get a number of apps now that you can have on your phone. There are different apps. So for example, Insight Timer is a great app for learning how to meditate. Meditation is a really good way to help with both anxiety and depression. And you don't need to learn to meditate cross-legged in a quiet room and clearing your mind. We don't meditate to get good at meditation. We meditate to get good at life. So you can do a type of meditation where you have a guided meditation. An Insight Timer has many of these. Mood Mission is great for those of you who are a little bit more competitive than others, because you're sent on a mission depending on your mood and you'll be asked to do something. Calm is a very good app. Smiling Mind, all of these apps give you different ways of coping with anxiety and depression. And Reach Out Worry Time is a little bit like the worry time I just explained to you, but also it helps you connect with people that you might be concerned about, people that you think might be having a problem in the workplace. And particularly if you work with a large team, you might suggest this to anybody that you think is going through a stressful time. So the last thing I want to leave you with is remember, regularly throughout the day, pause, reflect on the feeling that you have, reflect on the thought that led to that feeling, change the thought, and use your breathing to relax. Everything that you are stressing about today, that's making you anxious, that's making you depressed, it's really not that big a deal. And if you learn to just be more in the present, be more in the moment, you can really reduce the anxiety and the depression and the increasing levels of this in the workplace. So thank you very much for listening to me today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yolanda Coombs. That was a fantastic presentation. I was just making some notes while we were going along, and of course, I'm pretty sure some of you were doing the breathing exercising as we went along. But some of the key takeouts for me, particularly, were flatlining depression, where actually we do find a lot of people are generally doing the same old routine whilst in a very kind of anxious, kind of worrisome state. And I think that's something that's probably hidden, that we don't necessarily see from your traditional view of a depressed person. The other thing that really struck home was the fact that a lot of the ways we feel depressed or anxious are dictated by ourselves, not by the environment around us, but sometimes by other people, but mostly by ourselves. And it's those threats to our self-esteem, where we believe in a certain way and think in a certain way that lead to certain thoughts and feelings that we actually have control over. So that was fascinating. And of course, learning to change that thought changes that feeling. So we have got a few questions come through. So we will maximize as much time as you can to answer those questions. So the first one we've got here is, how do you approach a depressed individual and convince them to seek medical help?
So one of the things is that you may or may not be able to convince somebody, okay? Adults have autonomy, they can choose. I often get people calling me and saying, I want my wife to come and see you, or I want my husband to come and see you. And my answer is always the same. This is my number, give it to them, and if they want to come, they're very welcome. So we can't convince somebody to go, but what we can do, and what is really, really important, perhaps the most important thing, is to let people know that there is help, particularly when people are very depressed or feeling suicidal. And I did want to mention that suicide is on the increase, particularly amongst young men in Kenya. is to let them know that they won't always feel this way, that there is somebody who can help. And that's the most important thing. To be there to listen, to not judge. Often people need to decant what they're feeling. They don't want you to solve the problem for them. They just need to be able to share how they're feeling. And it's an old adage, but a problem shared is a problem halved. It's one of the reasons why that worry time exercise works, that when you are able to share what you're feeling and what you're going through, you get a better perspective on what's happening.
Thank you. Another question we've got, this is an interesting one, and very simple. What of relationship breakup stress? Is that any different?
No, I mean, stress is stress in the body. One of the interesting things is that the part of the brain where you feel emotional pain and the part of the brain where you feel physical pain is in the same region. And it's not exact in different people, it's in different places, but it's very closely related. And it's why, for example, if you were in your kitchen and you fell over and banged your knee, it may not hurt. But if you were on stage in front of 1,000 people, it would take a much longer to get over that same injury to your knee. Now, one of the things about relationship breakups is that we do sometimes physically feel pain from a breakup. And there is actually a syndrome, broken heart syndrome, where people have actually died when a loved one has passed on or left them. They've had an event that has led to them dying, an MI, a cardiac arrest, which is often called broken heart syndrome. You often hear of people who've been married a long time, and when one dies, the other person dies soon after. So the stress that you get from relationship issues, and it's one of the things, and thank you for this question, that I probably should have mentioned, is that things that happen outside of work are going to affect you in the workplace. You cannot be going through a breakup, a divorce, a difficult relationship issue, and put it to one side. There are some people who are more able to do it than others, but it is going to have an effect on you. And know that sometimes when people are snapping or difficult at work, maybe you don't know what's going on in their private life, and maybe that's why they're not being their normal happy self.
Great. I think it's tying to the last sentence that you had on the answer to the last question. So someone's asked, what signs can help an employer identify someone within their organization that might have stress and depression or on the verge of having a breakdown?
So certainly with depression, I would say if somebody's calling in sick a lot, having a lot of minor ailments, that can be a sign of anxiety or depression. As I mentioned, anxiety-related illness is often things like irritable bowel issues, digestive issues. You can sometimes see a lot of skin conditions related to anxiety. Depressed people, also will be taking time off. You can spot depressed people in that they can be withdrawn, but some people just don't show any excitement. You can see that maybe they smile, but they don't smile with their eyes. They just smile with their mouth. You can notice that people don't have the same passion and enthusiasm for the work. People who are depressed can often just look very, like as if there's nobody home behind their eyes. They're very unemotive. So the biggest thing to look out for is change in people. And when you notice a change, just ask somebody, are they okay? Don't do it if you can. Try not to do it in front of other people. Just say, do you need someone to talk to? Would you like to go for a coffee? Is there any way I can help? But notice a change in somebody's behavior. One of the most upsetting things is that there was a study done recently looking at the Instagram and Facebook posts of people who've committed suicide. And some people posted literally just hours before committing suicide, a post that would give the impression that everything was okay in their lives. So it is about taking time to really see what's going on under the surface and making sure that you are there for people if you see any signs that they're asking for help.
And what, someone's asked, what easy steps can an employer take to reduce stress in the workplace?
So definitely think about the culture. What is the culture of your workplace? Is your culture one where people can contribute, where people can ask questions, where people can participate? None of us go to work purely to get paid. We need to have another reason. We need to have our why. Why do we go to work? What is it that intrinsically motivates us? And so people need to feel motivated. They need to feel rewarded. They need to feel that whatever they do is really important. Because if you don't feel that what you do is important, that's going to lead to suppression and depression. If you feel that whether I turn up or not, nobody's going to notice, that's going to make you feel depressed. So the most important thing any employer can do, any manager, is to reward their staff with praise, to reward their staff sufficiently well in terms of compensation, but to make sure they feel motivated and happy. In terms of anxiety, try and have a culture where you're not bashing people, where you're not victimizing, where you're not pointing the finger when something goes wrong. Mistakes will always happen. It's about setting a learning culture where people learn from their mistakes. If we were going to say that you can't make any mistakes, imagine what kind of world we would live in, because it means when a baby took their first 2 steps, as soon as they fell over, we would all say, well, you're useless at walking. It doesn't happen that way. We encourage them, we support them, we say, try again. Yet in the workplace, when somebody makes a mistake, we're very quick to point the finger and say, you made a mistake, instead of, okay, you've made a mistake, what can we learn from it? How do we take it forward? So an employer who has an open growth mindset, who allows people to make mistakes, allows people to learn from their mistakes, is going to be have a much more productive and more engaged workforce. Disengagement at work is one of the biggest problems that Kenya faces. And there was a global survey done a few years ago showing that in Africa, 60% of employees are disengaged. And people become disengaged because they're not motivated, they don't feel that the work they do is important. And disengaged employees are more likely to make mistakes. They're more likely to commit fraud. They're more likely to do things that you don't want them to be doing for your business or your organization.
And this is a great question. So what types of foods are best in promoting overall mental health? And is there a specific diet one should follow?
I wouldn't say there's a specific diet, but there are certain things that we know are not good for mental health. So there's a lot of research at the moment around the microbiome. The microbiome is this area of the gut where we have these good bugs that we need. We have learned in recent years that we actually have neurons, the same neurons that we have in our brain, we have them in our gut. Often you'll say things like, my gut feeling on this is such, and that comes from the actual, that some people are actually saying we have a brain in our gut now. So foods that promote health are eating, as you might imagine, a variety of foods. We know that actually fermented foods are really good for our health. Things like sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, all of the yogurt, fermented foods that have probiotic foods are very good for us. We know that sugar is something we should try and avoid, and sugar either in its raw form or sugar in terms of its converted form, so refined carbohydrates, white flour, those kinds of starchy things we should try and avoid because they convert to sugar, and a lot of sugar in our body then affects our insulin response. People who are diabetic, people who are overweight are more likely to suffer from anxiety and depression. What we don't know is whether it's causal or whether it's just related.
And sorry, the questions are beginning to come through quite thick and fast, so we'll try and answer as many as we can. So going back to foods, serotonin levels in the brain are kind of tasked with kind of keeping us happy and healthy. So when it comes to panic attacks specifically, and people suffering from panic attacks, is it that the serotonin levels have dropped? and they need to look at diets, foods like omega-3s and magnesiums. So I think there's a question around what are panic attacks? What is actually happening to me when I'm having a panic attack? How do I deal with it in that situation?
Yeah. So a panic attack is when anxiety has completely got out of control. The most important thing you can do in a panic attack is get your breathing under control. And that's why that exercise I suggested, where you look at a clock, you breathe in for 5 seconds, out for 5 seconds, in for 5, out for 5, and you keep going until the panic has subsided, is a useful approach. You need to try and just focus on being in the present and stop thinking about the thought that elicited the initial panic attack. Anxiety can be related to serotonin, and people who have got issues around serotonin, can take antidepressants. Serotonin is more related to depression than to anxiety. Serotonin is an interesting chemical because we get serotonin when we feel respected, when we feel that what we're doing is worthwhile, when we have a contribution to make. Serotonin can be increased by certain foods. Certainly eating foods for brain health. We know that things like the omega-3s, having good oil in your good fats, your brain actually consumes a huge amount of energy. And if you have good fats in your diet, healthy fats, so avocados, coconut oil, those kinds of fats, stay away from things like corn oil and stay away from things like margarine. Those are not going to be good for your brain health. And if your brain is not healthy, then your emotions are likely to not be healthy either. So there's a lot of things you can do. One of the most important things you can do if you have depression and anxiety is to take regular exercise. There have been many, many randomized controlled trials which have been done where people have been randomized either to have antidepressants, therapy or counseling, or exercise. The exercise group always outperforms. And that's because regular exercise does a number of things. When we're out in nature, it already calms down our cortisol levels. If you work in an office and you don't have windows, or if you work in an office where you tend to go very early and stay late, try and get outside at lunchtime. Try and put plants around your office. It makes a huge difference to people's mood if you have a lot of plants. When we look at nature, part of the reason is there are what's called fractals in nature, repeating patterns. Our brains love looking at those kinds of repeated patterns, and it actually calms us. So there's many things you can do to reduce anxiety and depression. Sorry, I lost the question a bit there.
No worries. Linked to that, and I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but is it advisable to self-prescribe mood stabilizers? And if yes, which are the most effective ones?
The answer is no. It is not a good answer to self-prescribe. With any drug, even if you're thinking about taking something for a headache medicine, there are side effects. And you need to know what those side effects are. There are drug interactions. What other drugs am I taking? If you are on any drug, you need to know how to take it, when to take it, how to taper off. For example, if you need antidepressants, if you go to your family doctor or a psychiatrist, they can try, because not all antidepressants work for everybody. People need different combinations, and you need to go onto them slowly, you need to come off them slowly. So you cannot self-medicate at all, and you may actually cause more harm to yourself than in terms of benefit. But the things you can do for yourself, really focus on eating a diet full of fresh vegetables and fruit, a plant-based diet. Make sure that you have a lot of exercise. Make sure that you are sleeping well.
Okay. And we've got a really good question here. So often those who have had episodes of depression and anxiety find it difficult to transition fully into the workplace. They feel ashamed about their circumstance. Some employers may not see things like depression and anxiety as a quote unquote real medical problem. And some may not know how to engage with the employee. How can employers go about combating this?
So one of the big things I think, which we all have a responsibility for, is changing the way that we look at emotional health. Nobody has a problem saying, you know, if they have a few days off work, nobody has a problem coming back into the office and saying, oh, I had a really bad stomach bug, or I had a really bad flu. But people are hesitant and reticent to say, actually, I was feeling a bit low and I needed to take a few days off. It is becoming more common, particularly in places like the United States, where people talk about taking a mental health day. I need a day off. And so we all have a responsibility to try and reduce the stigma around things like anxiety and depression. When I am in a large room, if I was with people and I would ask people, who's ever felt depressed or who's ever felt anxious? It would be very few people who would say they've never ever felt one of those feelings. We've all felt anxiety and depression at some point. And so being able to talk more freely about it, more openly, employers having policies around mental health days, that you can take a day off. Because we know that when people have mental health issues, emotional health issues, they are likely to get physically sick. Our emotional brain, our emotional mind, and our physical body are completely intertwined. If you think about when you blush, your cheeks go red, you feel warm, that was a thought that made that physical reaction in your body. When you gag or retch at something disgusting, that was a thought that made that physical reaction happen. When you're sexually aroused, that's a thought. Our physical and emotional mind are completely intertwined, and therefore people will get sick if we don't deal with the emotional health problems. So employers have a responsibility to check in with their employees, to have policies in place to enable people to get the care and support that they need. I work with some employers who will send people to me who have a problem so that I can help, and it doesn't have to be me, there's many people out there who can help people who are facing things like anxiety and depression. And it makes sense, because if you don't do that, then that employee is likely to take time off with physical problems. They're not going to be performing well at work. They're not going to be doing their best. And all the while you'll be paying for them. So the sooner that you can help them out, the better.
Great, and we'll take probably 2 more questions to kind of end the Q&A. Thank you very much, first of all, for all your excellent questions. We're happy with the level of participation and engagement. So this question is a bit more serious. So symptoms to look out for in a depressed person before they get to the suicidal stage.
So it's very difficult, because often the people who are most likely to commit suicide don't talk about it. So people who talk about suicide actually are less likely, because it's a cry for help, and they're using it as a way of engagement. It is most often, but not always, men, and it is people who get to a point where they feel there is no way out, there is no escape hatch, there is nothing else I can do. Suicide is often dramatized, we see it in movies, but most often it's somebody who has given up on life, who feels that they have no options, that there is no way out. So the most important thing you can tell somebody who is depressed is there is help and things can change. It's that feeling that there is nothing else I can do. Most people who want to commit suicide, it's not so much that they want death, they don't want the current situation they're in, and they don't know how to get out of it. And so providing them with a window or with an option, or showing them that there is an alternative, is what they need. But people who have become very withdrawn, people who feel that they look as if they're in a dead end and they don't know how to get out of it, they are the people to be worried about.
And a final question, which I think raises a bit of discussion, is the effectiveness of behavioral change therapy versus medication, vis-a-vis the chemical implications of anxiety and depression, which is the more effective route for treatment?
So, for different people, some people have a wonderful response to medication, some people don't. We know now, because there's a 30-year rule when research and data gets released 30 years later. We do know now that some of the drugs trials that were done 30 years ago on antidepressants weren't as effective as they were marketed as. So the drugs companies took selected studies to market their antidepressants, and not all the studies. So we do also know that, particularly with antidepressants, there is a placebo effect. That because antidepressants tend to have a lot of side effects, because people feel the side effects, because they know they can feel the side effects, maybe they've got a tremble in their hands or a dry mouth, they think, well, it must be working, and therefore they get better because of the placebo effect. To be honest, if they get better because of the placebo effect, that's excellent, that's brilliant. But for some people, about a third of people, they have no effect from antidepressants. So different people need different types of therapy. It depends on what approach works for you. There isn't a one-size-fits-all. Some people having counselling works, some people having cognitive behavioural therapy, some people would like hypnotherapy or neurolinguistic programming. There are a range of therapies. What I would say to people is, don't give up. Look around, look for somebody who you get on with, who you feel is empathetic and sympathetic to you and has a similar outlook on life that you can work with. But it isn't a life sentence that if you're an anxious or depressed person that you need to remain that way. There are many, many different ways of helping you, and there are many people who have a depressive episode and never have another one in their life. So don't take it that once this has happened to you that you're going to have it forever.
Okay, great. So we've run through the kind of 20 minutes for the Q&A, and I'm pretty sure there's a couple of questions maybe we still haven't answered, but we've tried to go through most of them. So thank you, Dr. Coombs, for giving us your honest, transparent insight into some quite, emotive and sensitive questions as well. I think the presentation was fantastic, and I think we've all taken away a little bit that we can implement in our own lives as employers, as individuals, particularly breathing. Such a simple thing, doesn't cost a thing, but maybe sometimes we get it wrong. And of course, we had a few slides prepared around what we're doing with our insurance partners as JWSeagon to bring some of these kind of health and well-being tools to your disposal through insurance products. And coming out of the presentation and the webinar, we'll be sending you through the slide deck, which has got more information on it. But just simple things like an employee assistance program, which is absolutely key nowadays, particularly for larger corporates and larger organizations, but also SMEs, in promoting a culture of well-being. And we're very happy that we were able to spend the time with you today and everyone to promote this topic of well-being, because it is about prevention rather than cure. The healthier we are, the happier we are, the less costly it is for us individually and as for employees in the long run. So if you do want to find out more information about our worldwide health plan, which we've partnered with Cigna on, by all means, you can contact us using the contact details that you can see on the screen. But of course, I'm sure, Dr. Yolanda, there will be a lot more questions that will be relevant for you as well. So of course, I'm pretty sure we will be sending through your contact details to the attendees. So if they do have any questions, if they do want to get in touch with you, if there's any issues that they're struggling with personally or at work, or indeed employers who are looking to kind of engage certain support services, then I'm sure they'll be getting in touch. But thank you everyone for your time. Appreciate the questions. And we look forward to you joining us in future for our kind of continual series on topics around health and well-being. If you do have any suggestions on topics that you'd like us to cover, by all means, email us on talktous@JWSeagon&Co, and we'll do our best to kind of accommodate those questions and thoughts coming through. Once again, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Take care.